On the 20th of April, 2026, China launched its first National Reading Week. Events run across the country, book fairs, reading salons, author lectures, library open days. The State Council had decided that the fourth week of April each year would be designated for reading promotion. A new set of national reading promotion regulations had come into force 2 months earlier, in February. The official framing was straightforward: build a book-loving society, increase public literacy, make reading accessible across age, class, and geography, from urban reading spaces in Shanghai to rural book donation programs in Jiangxi. It is a reasonable set of goals. Meanwhile, it is not the complete picture. Because in the same country, in the same period, schools have been ordered to ban or strictly restrict mobile phones on campus. Gaming time limits for minors have been codified into law. Research published by Chinese universities documents how excessive smartphone use damages sleep, memory, and academic performance among students. National Reading Week is officially about books, but it lands inside a much larger policy conversation. And understanding that conversation tells you something about how the Chinese state is thinking about attention and about what a good life should look like. Welcome to the China Memo. We make unbiased observations on structural trends. I'm your host, born in China, trained in Western finance. Let's establish the basics before complicating the picture. National Reading Week is new. The first iteration ran from April 20th, 2026, launched alongside the 5th National Conference on Reading in Nanchang, Jiangxi. It is organized under the guidance of the National Press and Publication Administration. The legislative foundation is the National Reading Promotion Regulations, which came into force on February the 1st, 2026. The language in those regulations is positive and educational in tone. The aim is to promote reading among the public, raise the population's intellectual, moral, scientific, and cultural level, and enhance what the regulations call social civility. Reading has also been written into national strategy. Xinhua reports that nationwide reading promotion has appeared in government work reports for 13 consecutive years. It is now explicitly part of the 15th five-year plan, which runs from 2026 to 2030. The infrastructure context is relevant. By the end of 2024, China had 3,248 public libraries holding 1.5 billion books. The new regulation calls for longer opening hours, better equipped reading rooms, and more systematic funding, with particular attention to rural areas where library access has historically been limited. A national survey cited during Shanghai's Reading Week events found that over 80% of Chinese adults now describe themselves as regular readers. That figure reflects self-reporting, which tends to be optimistic. But even discounted, it's suggesting reading has a meaningful presence in the daily lives of a significant share of the population. The claim this episode will examine is the official one. National Reading Week is primarily a cultural initiative. It is about books, libraries, literacy, and enriching public life. It is not a campaign against the phones or screens. That claim is accurate as far as it goes. None of the official documents on National Reading Week mention smartphone addiction, social media, or screen time as a target. The regulations are framed entirely in positive terms. More reading, better access, richer cultural life. It's the language of aspiration rather than restriction. The activities planned under the week reflect that framing. Sub-forums at the National Conference covered school and family reading, rural literacy, urban reading spaces, library engagement, youth and elderly reading, and digital publishing. These are genuine policy areas. The concerns they address are real. For example, rural communities with limited library access, elderly people who have been left behind by digital platforms, children who have not developed reading habits. China also has a legitimate historical interest in reading culture. It is not purely manufactured. Classical Chinese literacy and philosophical traditions place enormous value on learning, scholarship, and the written word. A state initiative that positions reading as a social norm rather than an elite hobby has genuine cultural roots. So the official framing deserves to be taken seriously before being complicated. Here is where the framing starts to be inefficient as a standalone explanation. National Reading Week does not exist in isolation. It exists alongside a set of policies that directly address screen time, digital habits, and what Chinese authorities view as the harmful effects of excessive technology use, particularly among young people. The school phone ban is the clearest example. Chinese education authorities have ordered schools to ban or strictly restrict mobile phone use on campus. The stated rationale is to improve students' focus on study and combat game addiction. This is a structural reallocation of cognitive capital, an intervention designed to ring-fence the academic day from algorithmic distraction. Gaming time limits are a second example. Chinese regulations restrict the hours that minors can spend on online games. The limits are enforced through real name registration systems, which link gaming accounts to national ID numbers. Minors are permitted to play for limited hours during weekdays and slightly more on weekends and holidays. Research published by Chinese universities adds a third layer. Studies document correlations between excessive smartphone use among students and reduced sleep quality, impaired memory function, lower physical activity, and weakened academic self-efficacy. These studies are not obscure. They are published in mainstream Chinese academic journals and cited in policy discussions. Read together, these policies form a coherent picture. The state is concerned about how young people, and increasingly adults, are allocating their attention. It is responding on two tracks simultaneously. The restriction track, phone bans, gaming limits, platform regulations. The positive reinforcement track, reading week, library investment, reading regulations. National Reading Week sits firmly on the positive reinforcement side. It does not mention phones, but it is designed to do what restriction alone cannot do, which is to make the alternative to screen time appealing, social, and culturally endorsed rather than simply mandated. This distinction between restriction and positive reinforcement is worth unpacking because it reflects a specific policy logic. Restriction policies, including bans, time limits, penalties, address behavior by making the undesired option unavailable or costly. They are effective within the contexts they apply to. A school phone ban reduces phone use during school hours. Gaming time limits reduce gaming time for minors during the restricted periods. But the restriction has limits. It does not change what people want to do. It changes what they are allowed to do in specific contexts. When the restriction is lifted, when a school day ends, when a gaming window opens, the underlying preference reasserts itself. Positive reinforcement works differently. It tries to make the desired behavior intrinsically attractive by associating it with social belonging, cultural identity, and shared ritual. A National Reading Week with events at libraries, schools, and community centers creates social occasions around reading. It gives students a collective experience of reading as something people do together. It gives parents a framework for family reading time that feels like participation rather than enforcement. The People's Daily description of Reading Week as an invitation to turn over a new leaf in the nation's journey toward a book-loving society is aspirational language. But aspiration is exactly what a positive reinforcement requires. You cannot nudge people toward a behavior by telling them it is compulsory. You nudge them by making it look like something worth wanting. Chinese policy has historically been more comfortable with restriction than nudge. The Reading Week initiative suggests a growing awareness that in the attention economy, restriction alone is not sufficient. The alternative must be made actively, structurally attractive. At the launch of the Hangzhou branch of the Reading Week, Chinese novelist Mai Jia presented a vital framework for this shift. He noted a historical irony. For over a century after the commercial automobile was invented, humans still actively chose to run, not to race the car, but to preserve their physical health. In the 2026 landscape, generative AI and algorithmic feeds are the new automobiles. Returning to physical, screen-free text is no longer a passive cultural hobby. It is a deliberate analog intervention designed to ring-fence human cognitive health and deep focus from total automation. This is why the alternative needs to be actively made attractive. The state has realized that, in a landscape where human time is commercially weaponized, nurturing an innovative class requires shielding the human asset itself. Now, let's map the stakeholders briefly. Publishers and the book industry benefit directly. A state-backed annual reading week, combined with regulations requiring libraries to expand their hours and collections, creates sustained institutional demand for books. Rural book donation programs create distribution channels into markets, in addition to commercial publishers who operate for profits. Libraries benefit from both the regulatory attention and the funding. The call for longer hours and better equipment reflects an acknowledgement that China's public library system, while large in number, has been underinvested in quality and accessibility relative to the scale of the population it serves. Short-form video platforms and gaming companies sit on the other side of this equation. They are not named in the Reading Week regulations, but they are the implicit competition. Every hour a student spends reading at a library event is an hour not spent on TikTok, Kuaishou, or a mobile game. The state is not restricting those platforms through Reading Week, but it is trying to make their primary alternative more culturally visible and socially rewarding. For rural communities, the focus on rural literacy and equal access to books represents a genuine policy interest that goes beyond the screen time debate. Rural China has been underserved by the digital economy in some respects. Access to quality educational content, physical books, and cultural institutions has historically been much weaker outside major cities. The reading regulations' emphasis on rural provision addresses a real equity gap. Now, here are the 3 markers worth watching. First, whether reading metrics actually move over the next 2 to 3 reading week cycles. The 80% self-reported regular reader figure is a baseline. Whether that share increases, whether library circulation numbers rise, and whether school-age reading scores improve in areas where reading week activities were concentrated. These are the observable outcomes that would validate the initiative's effectiveness. Watching whether the state moves to more rigorous measurement over time tells you how seriously it is treating the evidence question. Second, whether the positive reinforcement and the restriction tracks start to converge more explicitly. Currently, Reading Week and the school phone bans are officially separate initiatives. But if future policy documents begin framing them as parts of a unified health digital habits strategy, explicitly linking reading promotion to screen time reduction, that signals a more coherent and potentially more ambitious policy architecture. Watch for language changes in government work reports and 5-year plan documentation. Third, how digital reading is positioned within the framework. The Reading Week Subforum on Digital Publishing is a signal worth tracking. China has a large e-book and digital reading market. Platforms like WeRead, Tencent's reading app, have significant user bases. If the state frames digital reading as equivalent to physical reading for purposes of the initiative, it suggests a genuinely inclusive literacy goal. If digital reading is implicitly deprioritized in favor of physical books, the initiative may have an understated bias toward offline activity that goes beyond literacy and into a broader preference for non-screen time. National Reading Week is officially about books. That's true. The cultural goals are genuine. The library investment is real. The rural equity concern is legitimate. But National Reading Week is also the positive reinforcement phase of a state that is simultaneously running phone bans in schools, gaming limits for minors, and academic research programs on smartphone harm. Those initiatives are not in the same document, but they are in the same policy conversation. The design logic is coherent. Restriction tells people what not to do. Positive reinforcement gives them something to do instead, something that is socially endorsed, culturally grounded, and collectively experienced. Whether that combination actually shifts the attention economy in a meaningful direction is a longer-run empirical question. What is clear is that the Chinese state has decided that how its citizens spend their attention is a policy variable, not just a market outcome. National Reading Week is the most visible, benign expression of that decision. It will not be the last. This has been the China Memo. Thank you for listening. Before I go, nothing in this episode constitutes investment advice or trade recommendation. The China Memo is based on publicly available sources. For financial decisions, please seek qualified independent advice.